JJ Lopez and Helen Hunt Jackson's Ramona, 1884 through 2024, by David Smith. There was no Ramona such as Helen Hunt Jackson created in her book of that name. Before she wrote the book, Mrs. Jackson talked with me about the plot for her story and about the characters to use in it. I told her of the half-blood Indian girl who was born at the old Castaic headquarters of Rancho San Francisco. She had a rather tragic life, and Mrs. Jackson was very much interested in the possibilities of using her in the book. So I took Mrs. Jackson to meet two cousins of the Ramona I had known. Often I had heard them talk of Ramona and her many troubles. I introduced Mrs. Jackson to them and left them to answer the questions she wanted to ask. I suppose that Mrs. Jackson wanted real historic persons to use in her book, which I suppose was to be a history. I surely was surprised when I obtained a copy of the book and read what she had written. It was almost entirely fiction. The real Ramona was born at the Rancho San Francisco headquarters on the hill across the Santa Clara River and about 1/2 mile south of where Castaic Junction now is located. Her full name was Ramona Guadalupe Ridley. She was half Indian and she was a very good-looking girl, tall and not very dark. I knew her very well. She was older than I and used to do housework at the Del Valle headquarters near Castaic when I stopped there. Ramona probably never lived at the Rancho Camulos adobe, where some of the story takes place. I also knew Alejandro, the husband of Ramona. Mrs. Jackson spelled his name as Alessandro, which is not Spanish at all, but Italian. Alejandro was a sort of labor contractor among the Indians. He headed a band of Indian sheep shearers and used to contract to shear sheep. He had his shearers shear for my father many times. Alejandro probably was a part-blooded Indian, but he looked as though he had mostly Spanish blood. Helen Maria Fisk was born in Amherst, Massachusetts on October 14, 1830. Both of her parents were very strict. Her father was a minister, author, and professor of Latin, Greek, and philosophy at Amherst College. Her mother said Helen was inclined to question everything. Her sister Anne was the opposite and 2 years younger. She also had two brothers, but they died when they were babies. She began writing at a young age. As a little girl, Helen wrote a story called Letters from a Cat, which was published later. Her mother died when Helen was 14 of tuberculosis. Her and her sister were sent to live with relatives, then put into boarding schools in New York City, while their father went away to work as a missionary and to deal with his grief. One of her classmates was Emily Dickinson, an American poet. They remained friends all of their lives. Her father died in 1847 when Helen was 17. In 1852, at 22, Helen married Army captain and physicist Edward Bissell Hunt. They had two sons. The first one only lived a year, dying of a brain tumor. Her husband was killed at the Brooklyn Naval Yard in 1863 while experimenting with the submarine's explosive device. She lost her second son in April 1865 to diphtheria. He was 9 years old. As she was grieving, Mrs. Hunt began writing poems expressing her grief under the name of Mara. She used several pen names in the beginning, H.H., Saxey Holmes, and even a series of novels by no name. Very few women were writers in those days. They were mothers and housekeepers, or just in charge of the household while the husband worked. She had an amazing range of writings, including poems, essays, novels, letters, children's stories, and travel pieces. Mrs. Hunt's poems and articles were published in the New York Tribune as well as Harper and Century magazines. Bronchial health problems encouraged her to move to Colorado. Her doctor set her up in a house in a neighborhood known as Dead Man's Row. When she recovered from her latest attack, she met her second husband, William S. Jackson. He was an investor in the Rio Grande Railroad and a banker. His courtship involved driving her in a carriage and showing off this area of Colorado's beauty. This inspired her to write pieces promoting Colorado's beauty for travel magazines back east. She also wrote two novels. On October 22, 1875, they were married in a Quaker ceremony in New Hampshire, then moved back to Colorado and into a house. She decorated their home with objects and paintings she had collected throughout her travels. Her writing lost popularity at this time. In the fall of 1879, she returned to the East, wanting to return to her literary friends, including Emily Dickinson. Back in Boston, Newspapers were reporting the sufferings of the Ponca Indian tribe. They'd been forcibly removed from their reservation in Dakota to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. After many of the tribe died, Chief Standing Bear and 30 of his people traveled north to the old reservation to bury his son. They were arrested. The speech he gave in court encouraged the judge to set them free. Thomas Tibbles, editor of the newspaper the Omaha Herald, helped them as well. Chief Standing Bear and his people were still in trouble due to their time in jail and court. This had kept them from getting their crops planted for the season. Thomas Tibbles organized a lecture tour of the East to raise money for them. The Tibbles Bear Show, as the Omaha Herald called them, left Omaha on October 10, 1879, arriving in Boston on October 29th. Helen Hunt Jackson saw the lecture, met Standing Bear, and had found her cause. She began writing letters and articles to help his people and other Native American tribes. Mrs. Jackson began researching in the Astor Library in New York regarding the government's dealings with the North American Indians. She decided to write a book showing a record of the country's broken treaties and mistreatment of the Native Americans titled A Century of Dishonor. She delivered it to every member of Congress in January of 1881 with her husband. It was not very well received, but the critical reviews were good, and the report from the commission appointed by the president to study the Ponca situation was positive for the Indians. With attacks on her book and the negative criticism, friends suggested she go to Europe until things calmed down. When she returned to writing about the mistreatment of the Native Americans. The government offered her to be the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. She felt it was something meant to keep her quiet. They asked her to report on the status of the Mission Indians in California. Helen's reports weren't taken seriously. She still needed a story. She says she needed to touch the public's hearts. In late January 1882, she traveled first to Los Angeles, California, then to Santa Barbara, stopping by the Rancho Camulos, which belonged to the Del Valle family. This was the ranch where she found her inspiration for the Ramona story. In Santa Barbara at the Franciscan College, she studied more about the missions as well as traveled El Camino Real to see some of them. The idea of Ramona came to her suddenly one morning in November 1883. She went to the Berkeley Hotel in New York and began writing. The story came to her very easily, and she couldn't write fast enough. She wondered if she might be possessed. On March 8, 1884, she finished, and it was published by Roberts Brothers. It was instantly successful. She intended to set forth some Indian experiences in a way to move people's hearts, to influence public sentiment on the Indian question. Mrs. Jackson died 10 months after Ramona was published, August 12, 1885, of stomach cancer in San Francisco. She didn't get to see how successful her book became. She was 55. Ramona didn't help the Native Americans the way Helen wanted it to. It was well received as a love story, encouraging people to visit Southern California and Ramona country. It is still a very popular book and story and has been reprinted at least 300 times. Of course, there have also been movies made of the Ramona story. Beginning in 1910, the silent movie director D.W. Griffith, with Mary Pickford playing Ramona, filmed on location at Rancho Camulos in Piru, California. D.W. Griffith knew this was where Mrs. Jackson had found her inspiration. In 1916, another silent version was made with Ada Gleason as Ramona. In 1928, a third silent version was made with Dolores Del Rio as Ramona. This was the first silent movie to have a music soundtrack. A song titled Ramona was recorded by Gene Austin. It charted at number 1 in 1928.
Remember the rambling rose you wear in your hair, Ramona, when day is done you'll hear my call. Ramona, we'll meet beside the waterfall. I'd read.
It was written by Al Wolf Gilbert and Mabel Wayne. It has also been recorded by other artists. In 1936, another movie version, a talkie, starring Loretta Young, was made. This was 20th Century Fox's first color movie. It was very popular at the time. In 1946, Esther Fernandez was Ramona in a Mexican drama film. This one didn't do very well at the box office or with critics. In 2000, it was a Mexican novella with Kate del Castillo as Ramona. There were 74 episodes from April 3, 2000 through July 14, 2000. Ramona also became an annual play performed in Hemet, California, beginning on April 13, 1923. It's known as the Ramona Pageant. In 1993, it became California's official state outdoor play. The area where the play is performed is known as the Ramona Bowl. Two of the most famous actresses to play Ramona were Raquel Welch in 1959 and Anne Archer in 1969. Thousands of people enjoy it every year.